everyone. Pastor Liz here as we continue our Acts sermon series and our One Congregation, One Book Acts study as well. So this week we are jumping into Acts 9, focusing on probably a story that you have heard before many times. It's probably one of the most well-known stories from Acts, and then probably a lesser known story that you haven't heard before. So let's dive in. So I wanted to start with kind of where I'm coming from when I look at Acts. So as maybe some of the other pastors, and maybe you already know, Acts is a sequel to Luke. It follows the story of Jesus's disciples as they continue to share the good news of Jesus Christ after the ascension of Jesus. And so the big piece that I want to focus on is this idea that Acts tells us something about who God is. And then Acts also tells us how God is transforming this world through the gospel, through the good news of Jesus Christ. And thinking about this idea of transformation, what does Acts mean when the book of Acts thinks about transformation? So transformation, I want you to think about it as how Acts views God bringing about salvation to followers of Jesus. Someone receives salvation through their transformation, through their changing, as God transforms them, as God changes them. And we'll see transformation in both of the stories that we're going to talk about today. So as you think about these two stories, I want you to think about some questions. So, what does Acts tell us about our lives today? How are these stories informing our lives today? And how might God be working in similar ways today? How might God be transforming us by telling us these stories? So I got really excited when we decided we were going to do an Acts sermon series, because it meant I got to use this book. I love this book. There's a glare on it. But anyway, it's called Intrusive God, Disruptive Gospel. It's by Matt Skinner. He's a professor of biblical studies at Luther Seminary in St. Paul, Minnesota. And I love this book because it gives us this new perspective of Acts that really, I think, helps us understand how Acts plays a part in our lives today. So he talks about how the gospel disrupts, and that kind of informs how I read these stories that we're going to talk about today. So what Jesus's disciples are teaching as they are going about their spreading of the good news in the book of Acts is the gospel of Jesus Christ, right? And so the gospel, Matt Skinner talks about, disrupts in the way that it asks these new followers of Jesus to reconsider their values and embrace new ones that align with the gospel, ones that align with the way that God calls us to be in this world. And oftentimes these new values butt up against the values of the empire of that day, the Roman Empire. And oftentimes these values butt up against the way things are. And so the book of Acts invites us to think about all of this in our everyday lives, and how we make decisions, and how we raise our kids, and how we live in community with one another, and how we do church together. And it asks us to see how we see God in our everyday experiences. So let's jump into this story from our Bible. So we are looking, as I said, at one of the most well-known stories of the book of Acts, and that is what many people call the conversion of Saul. So Saul is, when you think about Saul, I want you to think about him as he's one who is, I'm going to say, against the gospel. He's trying to stop the spread of the gospel of Jesus. And he's trying to intimidate Jesus' followers, round them up, bring them to Jerusalem, and have them killed, probably. Pastor Brock just preached on and just taught about Stephen. We see Saul at the end of Stephen's story. All of the coats of the people who are throwing stones at Stephen land at the feet of Saul. So we're told that Saul is headed to Damascus. And Damascus is in what we think of as modern day Syria. It's the same city, Damascus, today. It's 100 miles northeast of Jerusalem. And so Saul is on his way, and this blinding light hits his eyes, so much so that he can't see. And Saul starts to go through a transformation. He goes from a man who is trying to round up Jesus's followers and lead them off to Jerusalem to a man who is being led himself because he can't see. He's dependent upon others. And he also becomes a man, he changes from a man who is using his power over others, and he changes into a man who is overpowered by Jesus, right? And so this idea of transformation is all over the place in Acts. And this is the biggest one. And so we're told that it's Jesus, his voice, that comes to Saul. And as you think about this story, I want you to think about it in terms of how Saul understands God and how Saul understands himself. And we're told that Ananias, this man, has a vision, and he's called to help Saul see again. And so he has a role, even though he's skeptical, right? Because as we hear in this story, later on, is Saul trustworthy? Can people trust that he really has been changed? So Ananias, in a way, has a role in showing others that it's possible to see Saul in a new way. It's possible to see other people in a new way. How might God be inviting us to see ourselves in a new way? But how might God be calling us to see others in new ways as well? So that's my thoughts on Saul. Let's now look at the second story that we're seeing. Is this story about Peter raising Tabitha and healing this man, Aeneas. So the things that I really love about these stories, these miracle stories, is we hear the names of the people that Peter heals and raises from the dead. We don't often hear that in the Gospels when Jesus is healing people. So the fact that the author of Acts names these people is something that I think we should pay attention to. So Peter is healing. Peter is in these cities of Lydda and Joppa. And these cities are 25 and 35 miles away from Jerusalem to the northwest. And as I said, I love that these people are named, but I really want to focus on Tabitha because it's really good for us to see female disciples. And I want to highlight that because it's really important to see that it's not just men who are doing the work of being Jesus's disciples. That's also women who are called to be disciples of Christ even during this time. So Tabitha, we hear, has two names, Tabitha and Dorcas. And these two names, one is Aramaic and one is Greek, and they both mean gazelle in that language. And we're told that Tabitha is a disciple. She's a leader in her community. She is an artist. She's one who sews. She's one who uses her gifts that God has given her to serve others. And we can see that her death is a real loss to this community because we see that all of these widows are gathering around to mourn the loss of Tabitha, but also I wonder if they're afraid. They're afraid of what their future might hold, because there's someone who really cared for them, who's no longer alive. So what I want us to think about and get out of this story and hopefully be inspired by is discerning for ourselves, discerning the gifts that God has given us that we're then called to use to serve others. And realizing that these gifts might be small, but they could have a huge impact on another person, on a community. So as you're talking about this story, I want you to think about those gifts and think about the possibilities for those gifts that God might be calling you into. And then the last thing I want to talk about with Tabitha is this idea that she has two names. And I'm hoping to go that way with my sermon this week as well. I'm doing this video before I plan my sermon. So I want you to think about Tabitha. She has two names. She's known by two different names in two different cultures. Might Tabitha be a multicultural woman? Might Tabitha be one who crosses boundaries of two different cultures? In fact, might Tabitha be a bridge builder between two different cultures? It seems to me that that's something that a type of person that we really need in our world right now. Someone who's willing to cross the boundaries between different cultures, different kinds and types of people, different races of people right now. Who are the Tabithas in our world? Can you identify any? Because we need Tabithas right now, friends, right? So that's what I have for you. I hope that this brings you some good conversation in your groups. And I look forward to maybe getting some feedback and hearing about these conversations. So be well, friends, and I hope to see you all very soon. Bye now.